What if the stranger you showed kindness to wasn't testing your character, but silently choosing your destiny? For Maria Mitchell, a 26-year-old waitress trapped between her mother's medical bills and paintings she could no longer afford to finish, compassion had become muscle memory. Every morning at the Highland Diner, she steadied the trembling hands of William Sexton, a withdrawn old man who barely spoke and tipped in quarters. She thought she was just helping someone eat breakfast. She didn't know he was a ghost with a fortune, watching her through eyes that had already made their final judgment. Because one morning, William's chair sat empty, and in his place came a lawyer in a tailored suit, flanked by 4 bodyguards who made the coffee cups rattle. They weren't there for his bill. They were there for her. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because this story reminds us that sometimes the smallest kindness can change a life forever. The bell above the Highland Diner door had become the metronome of Maria's existence, not the cheerful welcome of opportunity, but the weary announcement of another hour, another order, another chance to smile through exhaustion. The diner itself belonged to a different era. Faded vinyl booths, the color of rust, countertops that had lost their shine decades ago, and the perpetual scent of burnt coffee competing with frying bacon. For Maria, it was both cage and refuge, the place where dreams went to wait. 6 days a week, from 5:30 in the morning until mid-afternoon, Maria performed the practiced choreography of survival. She moved through the cramped aisles with the efficiency of repetition, balancing plates without thinking, refilling cups on instinct, and wearing a smile that felt increasingly like a mask. The real Maria, the artist, the dreamer, lived in a cramped second-floor apartment 3 blocks away, surrounded by canvases gathering dust and paints drying in their tubes. Art school had become a ghost, buried beneath the mounting weight of her mother's chemotherapy bills and rent she could barely scrape together. Her regulars formed a predictable tableau. There was Marcus, the electrician who read yesterday's sports section and always left exactly $2. There were the administrative assistants from the medical office next door who dissected workplace drama over egg white omelets. And then there was William. William Sexton was different. He wasn't merely a regular, he was architecture. As permanent as the cracked tile behind the register. Every morning at 7:15 precisely, he would push through the glass door and make his way to the back corner booth, the one by the window where morning light cut through the blinds in amber strips. He never acknowledged anyone. His wardrobe never varied, a gray wool coat regardless of season, pressed slacks, and leather shoes worn smooth at the heels. His face carried the geography of a long life, his pale blue eyes seeming to look through the world rather than at it. He was silence personified. The first week he appeared, Jerry, Maria's perpetually harried manager, had issued a warning. Don't waste energy on the old guy in 4. He doesn't engage. Black coffee, whatever the special is, exact change. That's the transaction. Denise, the veteran server with the temperament of a hornet, had been more blunt. Somebody that unfriendly should sit at the counter, not take up a foretop, not worth the real estate. But Maria saw past the silence. She recognized the particular kind of loneliness that wraps itself in dignity, the quiet that isn't rudeness but something closer to grief. So she ignored Jerry's advice. The first morning she placed the menu before him with genuine warmth. "Good morning, sir. I'm Maria. Can I start you with coffee?" He grunted without meeting her eyes. She poured anyway. When she brought his plate, the usual scrambled eggs and sausage, she noticed the tremor in his hands as he reached for the pepper shaker. She returned the next day with the same greeting, and the day after. For an entire week, he met her attempts at connection with stone-faced silence. But Maria had learned patience from harder lessons than this. "The biscuits are fresh this morning," she'd offer. Or, "Looks like rain today. This coffee should help." Small offerings, expecting nothing. Then, 3 weeks into his silent patronage, everything shifted. She set down his breakfast and watched him struggle with the diner's dull knife, his swollen knuckles making the simple act of cutting toast an ordeal. Without hesitation, Maria picked up the knife. "Let me help," she said gently, cutting the toast into 4 neat squares. For the first time, William looked up. Those pale eyes met hers, and in that brief moment, she saw something flicker behind the walls. Surprise. Perhaps gratitude. Maybe something deeper. He gave a single, sharp nod, then returned his attention to his meal. It was a small victory that became their ritual. From that morning forward, the routine never varied. She'd bring his black coffee without asking. She'd deliver the daily special and cut his toast while he watched the world through the window. Sometimes she'd fill the silence with stories. The customer who'd tried to pay with a personal check from 1987, her dream of someday seeing the paintings in the Louvre, the way morning light hit the diner windows just right in October. He never responded, but she felt him listening. Occasionally, he'd leave an extra quarter beside his plate, a silent acknowledgement that somehow meant more than any $5 tip. Her coworkers found it baffling. "Still chatting with your silent boyfriend?" Denise would mock while wiping down counters. "You know he probably can't even hear you, right?" Jerry would shrug from behind the grill. "Let her talk to a wall if she wants. At least he pays and doesn't complain." Maria didn't care. Those 10 minutes each morning had become an anchor in the chaos of her life. In a world that constantly demanded more while giving less, this simple, one-sided connection felt pure. She wasn't performing kindness for a larger tip or recognition. When she looked at the solitary old man in the corner booth, she simply saw a human being who deserved a moment of warmth, even if he couldn't or wouldn't ask for it. What Maria didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that her unguarded compassion was being carefully observed, meticulously catalogued, and quietly judged by a mind far sharper than anyone in the Highland Diner could have imagined. Maria's life hadn't always been measured in coffee refills and breakfast specials. Once she had been a scholarship student at the Savannah College of Art and Design, her hands stained with charcoal instead of dish soap, her nights spent in studios that smelled of linseed oil and possibility. But that was before her mother's diagnosis, before the word stage 3 had rewritten every equation in her life. Art school became a luxury she couldn't justify when chemotherapy bills arrived like clockwork, each one a small catastrophe. So she'd come home to Atlanta, traded her brushes for order pads, and learned to smile through the particular exhaustion that comes from watching your dreams gather dust. The morning routine with William had stretched into months now, each day a quiet repetition of the one before. But lately, Maria had begun to notice changes, small things that made her artist's eye pause with concern. His hands shook more, not just the subtle tremor she'd first observed, but something deeper, more pronounced. Some mornings he could barely lift the coffee cup to his lips without the dark liquid threatening to spill over the rim. She'd find tiny puddles on the table afterward, evidence of a struggle he never acknowledged. It was a Wednesday in late September when she decided to intervene. The morning air had turned crisp, autumn asserting itself against the lingering heat of Georgia summer. William sat in his usual spot, and when Maria approached with the coffee pot, she could see his right hand trembling against the tabletop. "Mr. Sexton," she said softly, using his name for the first time. She'd learned it from Jerry's order log. "Would you like me to pour your coffee this morning? Save you the trouble?" He looked up at her then, those pale blue eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, his weathered face softened into something that almost resembled a smile, faint, like sunlight through heavy clouds, but unmistakably there. "I can manage," he said, his voice gravelly from disuse. "But thank you, Maria." Her name. He'd said her name. In all these months, those were the most words he'd ever spoken to her directly. She felt an unexpected warmth bloom in her chest. "You're welcome," she replied, setting the pot down and cutting his toast into the familiar squares. This time, when she glanced up, he was still watching her, not through her, but actually seeing her. The moment stretched between them, fragile and somehow significant. After that morning, something imperceptible shifted. William still didn't speak much, but his silence felt different, less like a wall and more like a comfortable quiet between people who understood each other without needing words. Maria found herself studying him more carefully, the way she used to study her subjects in figure drawing class. She noticed details she'd missed before, the way he always wore the same gold watch, its face catching the light when he reached for his water glass. The way he kept a small leather wallet in his breast pocket, and inside it, she'd glimpsed it once when he paid, a black and white photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile. The way he would sit for exactly 42 minutes, no more, no less, but always seemed reluctant to leave, lingering by the window as if the world outside required courage to face. One morning she caught him staring at the photo in his wallet, his thumb tracing the edge with a tenderness that made her throat tighten. He looked so profoundly alone in that moment that Maria had to turn away, busying herself with wiping down the counter to give him privacy with whatever memory held him captive. "She was beautiful," Maria said quietly the next time she refilled his cup, nodding toward the wallet he'd left open on the table. William's fingers stilled. For a heartbeat, she thought she'd overstepped, invaded some sacred space he'd never invited her into. But then he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. 52 years. Cancer took her 3 years ago. Every morning since, I wake up and forget she's gone. Then I remember. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with a grief Maria understood too well. She thought of her mother in that sterile hospital room, of how many mornings she woke up hoping the diagnosis had been a nightmare. "I'm so sorry," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. He nodded again, closing the wallet with careful precision, as if closing a chapter he could only bear to read in small doses. "She would have liked you. She always said kindness was the only currency that mattered." Maria felt her eyes sting. She squeezed his shoulder gently, a brief touch, barely there, and moved on to the next table before the moment could overwhelm her. The rain came on a Tuesday, turning the Atlanta morning gray and soft. The kind of rain that whispered against windows and made the diner feel like a ship adrift in a gentle storm. William arrived at his usual time, his gray coat darkened at the shoulders from the brief walk from his car, water droplets clinging to the brim of his hat. Maria brought his coffee and toast, and they settled into their familiar rhythm. But something felt different today. William seemed more present somehow, less lost in whatever distant place usually claimed him. He watched her as she worked, his pale eyes following her movements around the diner with an attention that made her self-conscious. When his 42 minutes were up, he rose slowly, leaving exact change on the table as always. But this time there was something else, a small manila envelope tucked beneath his water glass. "Mr. Sexton, you forgot," Maria started. But he was already at the door. He turned back, and for the second time in all these months, he smiled. A real smile this time, sad and sweet and final in a way that made her chest constrict with inexplicable unease. "I didn't forget," he said simply. Then he was gone, disappearing into the silver curtain of rain. Maria stood holding the envelope, feeling the weight of it in her hands. It was sealed, her name written across the front in careful, old-fashioned script. Denise was watching her with raised eyebrows, and Jerry was calling an order, but everything felt muted, distant. She waited until her break, took the envelope to the back room, and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was William's receipt from that morning, $2.65 for coffee and toast, and beneath it a note on cream-colored stationery, written in the same elegant handwriting. "You make these mornings worth waking up for. In a world that stopped seeing me years ago, you looked. That means more than you could possibly know. Thank you, Maria, for reminding an old man what it feels like to be human. W.S." Maria read it 3 times, each word settling into her bones with unexpected weight. Her eyes blurred with tears she didn't quite understand. It was just a thank you note, just words on paper. But something about the finality in those sentences, the way he'd written reminded instead of remind, made her heart clench with irrational fear. She folded the note carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket, carrying it close like a talisman. The rain continued its soft percussion against the diner windows, and Maria returned to her tables, to her coffee pots and manufactured smiles. She didn't know, couldn't have known, that William Sexton's chair would sit empty tomorrow, that the note in her pocket would become evidence of the last conversation they'd ever have, that kindness given freely and without expectation was about to become the catalyst that would shatter her entire world and rebuild it into something unrecognizable. The rain fell, the clock ticked, and Maria wiped down tables, unaware that the simple act of seeing another human being had just changed the trajectory of her entire life. 7:15 came and went. Maria found herself glancing at the door more than usual, her hands moving through their practiced motions while her mind lingered on yesterday's rain-soaked goodbye and the note still folded in her locker. William was never late. In all the months of their quiet ritual, he'd never once deviated from his schedule. 7:15, booth 4, 42 minutes exactly. But the corner booth sat empty. morning light pooling across its faded vinyl surface where William should have been. "Your boyfriend stand you up?" Denise called from the register, her voice sharp with amusement. Maria didn't respond. Something cold had settled in her stomach, a premonition she couldn't name. She wiped down the same section of counter 3 times, her eyes drifting to the door, waiting for the familiar silhouette of gray wool coat and careful, measured steps. 7:30, 7:45. The breakfast rush began to build, the usual parade of construction workers and office employees grabbing coffee before their day began. Maria moved through the choreography mechanically, pouring, smiling, taking orders. But part of her remained tethered to that empty booth, to the uncomfortable weight of yesterday's thank you note, to the finality she'd sensed in William's last smile. At 8:17, the bell above the door chimed. But the sound was wrong somehow. Too sharp, too bright, announcing something that didn't belong in the comfortable shabbiness of the Highland diner. Maria looked up from the omelet she was delivering to table 6, and the plate nearly slipped from her hands. 4 men in dark suits stood just inside the entrance, and they weren't there for breakfast. They were the kind of men you saw in movies. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the rigid posture of security professionals and the unsettling stillness of people trained to handle violence. They wore identical black suits that probably cost more than Maria's monthly rent, and their eyes swept the diner with professional assessment, cataloging exits and potential threats. Behind them, a 5th man stepped through the door. He was different. Younger, maybe mid-40s, with salt and pepper hair styled with precision and a charcoal suit that fit like it had been made for his exact measurements. He carried a leather briefcase and moved with the confident ease of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. His eyes, dark and intelligent behind wire-rimmed glasses, found Maria immediately, as if he'd been given her photograph to memorize. The diner fell silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Coffee cups paused halfway to mouths. Even Jerry emerged from behind the grill, his spatula still in hand, staring at the impossible scene unfolding in his establishment. The man in the charcoal suit approached Maria directly, weaving between tables with purposeful strides. The 4 bodyguards fanned out behind him, not threatening exactly, but creating an undeniable presence that made the small diner feel even smaller. Maria's coffee pot trembled in her hand. She set it down on the nearest table before she could drop it, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every instinct screamed that something terrible was about to happen, that this moment would cleave her life into before and after. "Miss Maria Mitchell?" the man asked. His voice was cultured, professional, with the careful enunciation of someone who spent his life choosing words with precision. Maria's mouth had gone dry. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. The man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something that might have been sympathy crossing his composed features. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a business card, extending it to her with both hands, a gesture that felt oddly formal, almost respectful. "My name is Randy Luis. I'm the senior partner at Luis & Associates. I represent the estate of Mr. William Sexton." The world tilted. Maria heard the words, understood them individually, but couldn't make them connect into meaning. Estate. Represent. The formal language of lawyers and death and things that happen to other people, not to exhausted waitresses in forgotten diners. "I don't understand," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Randy Luis's eyes held hers, and she saw genuine regret there. The expression of someone about to deliver news that would hurt. "Mr. William Sexton instructed me to find you immediately in the event of his passing. Miss Mitchell, I'm very sorry to inform you that Mr. Sexton died last night. He suffered a heart attack in his sleep. It was peaceful." The words hit like physical blows. Maria felt the air leave her lungs. The diner exploded into noise, gasps, whispers, the scrape of chairs as people turned to watch the drama unfold. Denise's hand flew to her mouth. Jerry stood frozen, his spatula hanging forgotten at his side. "No," Maria heard herself say. "No, I just saw him yesterday. He was fine. He was—" But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. He hadn't been fine. The trembling hands, the lingering by the window, the way he'd looked at her with those pale blue eyes, not through her, but at her, really seeing her as if memorizing her face. The note. God, the note. "You make these mornings worth waking up for." Past tense. He'd written it in past tense. Her legs felt unsteady. The diner seemed to spin around her, too bright, too loud, too real, and not real enough all at once. "Miss Mitchell," Randy Louise continued, his voice gentle but firm, "I understand this is a shock, but Mr. Sexton left very specific instructions. I need you to come with me to my office immediately. There are matters we need to discuss, legal matters that require your immediate attention." "I'm working," Maria said stupidly, as if that mattered, as if anything mattered, when William was dead, when the old man who'd become her morning anchor was gone. "I can't just leave." "Yes, you can." Jerry's voice cut through the fog. He'd moved closer. His face pale, eyes wide with something Maria couldn't identify. Shock, maybe, or the dawning realization that something significant was happening in his unremarkable diner. "Maria, go. It's fine. We'll cover your shift." Randy Louise nodded, appreciative. "I assure you, Miss Mitchell, this is urgent. Mr. Sexton was very clear about the timeline. His instructions were explicit. You must be informed today, this morning, before—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Before other parties become involved." The way he said "other parties" sent a chill down Maria's spine. The bodyguards stood motionless, but their presence suddenly made terrible sense. This wasn't just about delivering sad news. This was about something bigger, something that required security and lawyers and immediate action. "I don't understand what this has to do with me," Maria said, hating how her voice shook. "I was just his waitress. I barely knew him." Something flickered in Randy Louise's expression. Surprise, maybe? Or was it pity? "Miss Mitchell, I don't think you understand. You're the reason I'm here. You're named in Mr. Sexton's will, and we need to execute his wishes immediately before his family discovers what he's done." The diner erupted in fresh whispers. Maria felt every eye on her, felt the weight of curiosity and speculation and disbelief pressing against her skin. None of this made sense. Wills were for family, for people who mattered, not for waitresses who cut toast and poured coffee. "Please," Randy Louise said, his voice lowering, meant only for her now. "Mr. Sexton trusted you. The least we can do is honor that trust. Come with me, and I'll explain everything." Maria looked at the empty booth in the corner, at the space where William should have been sitting, watching the world through rain-streaked windows. She thought of his smile yesterday, sad and sweet and final. She thought of his note, still folded in her locker, words of gratitude that now felt like goodbye. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was breaking. And somehow, impossibly, her life was about to change in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." The ride from the diner to downtown Atlanta passed in a blur of disbelief. Maria sat in the back of a black Mercedes, one of the bodyguards driving while Randy Louise sat beside her, making polite conversation she barely heard. Through the tinted windows, the city transformed from her familiar landscape of strip malls and aging storefronts into something gleaming and foreign. Glass towers reflecting morning sun, streets lined with luxury cars, a world she'd only ever passed through on her way to somewhere else. They pulled up to a building that made her breath catch. Louise and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a steel and glass monument that seemed to scrape the sky itself. The lobby was a cathedral of wealth, floors of polished marble and cream and gold, a reception desk that looked carved from a single piece of mahogany, and a chandelier that probably cost more than every car in the Highland Diner's parking lot combined. Maria became acutely aware of her uniform, the pale blue dress with its white apron, the sensible shoes, worn smooth at the heels, the faint smell of coffee and bacon grease that clung to her clothes. She felt like an imposter, a stain on all this perfection. "This way, Miss Mitchell," Randy Louise said gently, guiding her toward a private elevator with a hand that never quite touched her, respectful of the chasm between their worlds. The elevator opened directly into a reception area so elegant it felt hostile. A woman in a designer suit glanced at Maria with barely concealed disdain before Randy led her past, down a hallway lined with oil paintings that Maria's artist's eye recognized as originals, each one worth more than she'd earn in a lifetime. He stopped at double doors of dark wood, hand on the brass handle. "Miss Mitchell, before we go in, I need you to understand something. Mr. Sexton's children are already inside. They've been informed of your inclusion in the will, and they are not pleased. I need you to stay calm, no matter what they say. I'm here to ensure Mr. Sexton's wishes are honored. Do you understand?" Maria's throat tightened. She nodded, unable to form words. The doors opened onto a boardroom that belonged in a different universe from her life. A table of gleaming mahogany stretched the length of the room, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Atlanta sprawling below, the city reduced to a toy model from this height. But Maria barely noticed the room. Her attention locked on the two people seated at the far end of the table, and the hatred radiating from them hit like a physical force. The woman was in her early 50s, dressed in a black suit that screamed expensive mourning. Her hair was pulled back severely, highlighting sharp cheekbones and eyes like chips of ice. She held a designer handbag in her lap like a weapon, her knuckles white around the handle. The man beside her was older, maybe late 50s, with William's pale blue eyes but none of his quiet dignity. His face was flushed red with barely contained rage, his expensive suit doing nothing to soften the aggression in his posture. "This is her?" the woman spat before Randy could make introductions. "This is the gold-digging little—" "Clara," Randy's voice cut through the venom like a knife. "I'll remind you that we're here to execute your father's will, not to trade insults." Our father was clearly not in his right mind. The man, Henry, Maria's shocked brain supplied, growled. "This is elder abuse, manipulation. We'll contest this in every court in Georgia." "You're welcome to try," Randy said calmly, gesturing for Maria to sit. She sank into a chair on the opposite side of the table, as far from William's children as the room allowed. The leather was butter soft, expensive, and she perched on its edge, afraid to leave marks. "But I assure you, Mr. Sexton was examined by 3 independent psychiatrists in the month before his death. All confirmed his complete mental competency. This will is airtight." He opened his briefcase with measured precision, withdrawing a leather-bound folder. The bodyguards positioned themselves at strategic points around the room, a detail that suddenly made terrible sense. "The last will and testament of William Robert Sexton," Randy began, his voice taking on the formal cadence of legal proceedings. "Dated September 15th, 2025. Witnessed and notarized." Maria's hands twisted in her lap. September 15th, 2 weeks ago. Had he known? Had he felt death approaching and made his preparations? Randy read through the preliminary legal language, executor appointments, tax instructions, charitable donations that made Maria's head spin with their size. Millions to museums and hospitals, foundations she'd never heard of but that clearly meant something to the Sexton siblings, whose faces grew darker with each bequest that wasn't to them. Then Randy's voice shifted, and Maria's world tilted. "To Miss Maria Mitchell, who in my final year showed me a kindness I thought the world had forgotten." He paused, looking up at her over his glasses. "The sum of $300,000 to be transferred immediately upon my death." The room exploded. "Absolutely not." Henry lunged to his feet, his chair clattering backward. "That's insane. She's a nobody, a waitress who poured his coffee." "Henry, sit down," Randy commanded, and something in his tone made the larger man comply, though rage still mottled his face. Randy continued as if there'd been no interruption. "Additionally, Miss Mitchell is to receive full ownership of the Highland Diner property and business, including all assets, free and clear of any debt or encumbrance." Maria couldn't breathe. $300,000. The diner. The words made sense individually but not together, not connected to her name, not real. "This is fraud!" Clara's voice rose to a shriek. "She seduced a senile old man." Your father was neither senile nor seduced," Randy cut her off, his voice ice, "and you will speak respectfully of Miss Mitchell, or I will have you removed from these proceedings." He reached into the folder and withdrew a smaller envelope, sealed with red wax, old-fashioned and somehow intimate in this modern boardroom. Maria's name was written across the front in William's careful script. "And finally," Randy said, his voice softening, "a personal item to be delivered directly to Miss Mitchell." He stood, walked around the massive table, and placed the envelope in Maria's trembling hands. It was heavier than she expected. Something solid inside, something more than paper. "That concludes the portions of the will relevant to Miss Mitchell's presence here today," Randy said, returning to his seat. "The remainder of the estate, including the primary residence and investment portfolio, is divided between Henry and Clara Sexton as previously outlined." How much? Henry demanded. How much did she manipulate him out of? Randy's smile was thin. The amounts bequeathed to Miss Mitchell represent approximately 0.5% of your father's total estate. You and your sister are each inheriting just under $43 million. I suggest you count your blessings rather than contest this will. The numbers were incomprehensible. 43 million each. And they were angry about her 300,000. About a diner William had probably owned as an afterthought. Maria's hands shook as she broke the wax seal. Inside was a single brass key, old and ornate, and a note card in William's handwriting. To the one who treated me like a man, not a name. You saw me when I had become invisible. This key opens the door to a place I can no longer go, but perhaps you can make it live again. Use what I've given you to build something beautiful. You reminded me why kindness matters. Now I remind you, you matter. W.S. Tears blurred the words. Maria pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold in the sob building in her chest. William. Lonely, silent William who'd sat in booth 4 and let her talk at him about Paris and paintings and dreams that felt impossible. He'd been listening. He'd been seeing her too. This isn't over, Clara hissed, standing abruptly. We'll fight this. We'll destroy you. Try, Randy said mildly. But I should mention that your father anticipated your reaction. He left very specific instructions regarding any attempt to contest Miss Mitchell's inheritance. Should you pursue legal action against her, your own inheritances will be reduced by half, with the proceeds going to charity. It's all in Section 7, Paragraph 3, should you care to review it. Henry and Clara stared at him, faces twisted with impotent fury. Then, without another word, they swept from the room, the door slamming behind them with enough force to rattle the windows. Silence descended, broken only by Maria's quiet, hiccuping breaths. I'm sorry about that, Randy said gently. They loved their father in their way, but they hadn't spoken to him in over a year. They didn't know him anymore. But you did, Miss Mitchell, and he knew you. Maria clutched the brass key, feeling its weight, its promise, its impossible gift. $300,000. The diner. And a key to a door she didn't understand but somehow knew would change everything. Her life had split in two, just as she'd sensed it would. There was the Maria who'd woken up this morning to pour coffee and cut toast, and there was this Maria, sitting in a boardroom high above the city, holding a dead man's gratitude and a key to a future she couldn't imagine. She didn't know which frightened her more. Randy gave her 20 minutes to compose herself. She spent them in a bathroom that was nicer than her entire apartment, staring at her reflection in a mirror framed in gold leaf, wondering who she'd become in the span of a single morning. When she emerged, he was waiting with a gentle patience that made her want to cry all over again. Miss Mitchell, there's one more thing, the key. Do you know what it opens? Maria shook her head, pulling the brass key from her pocket. It was old, the kind that belonged to a different era, its surface worn smooth by years of use. Mr. Sexton owned a property, a private estate on Lake Lanier, about an hour north of the city. He hasn't lived there in 3 years, not since his wife passed, but he maintained it exactly as it was. He wanted you to see it. He left instructions for me to take you there today, if you're willing. Maria thought of the diner, of her shift she'd abandoned, of her mother who would be calling soon to ask why she wasn't answering her phone. She thought of her small apartment and smaller life, of everything that had felt certain when she'd woken up this morning. Okay, she whispered. Yes. The drive took them away from Atlanta's gleaming core, through suburbs that gradually gave way to pine forests and winding roads. Randy drove himself this time, the bodyguards following in a second car, and he filled the silence with gentle explanations. William had been an architect, he told her, one of the most celebrated of his generation, responsible for museums and civic centers across the country. He'd made his fortune not just in design, but in the real estate empire he'd built alongside his practice. He was worth just over $90 million when he died, Randy said quietly. Most people who knew his work assumed he was worth far more, but William lived modestly in his later years, very modestly. Maria thought of the faded tweed coat, the worn shoes, the way he'd sat in the diner's cheapest booth and ordered the same $2 breakfast every morning. Not poverty, choice. They turned onto a narrow road that seemed to lead nowhere, trees pressing close on both sides. Then, suddenly, a gate emerged from the foliage. Wrought iron, elaborate, and streaked with rust. Randy entered a code, and the gates groaned open like something waking from a long sleep. The driveway curved through untamed gardens where roses had grown wild, and azaleas bloomed in defiant bursts of color against the neglect. Then the house appeared, and Maria's breath caught. It wasn't a mansion in the ostentatious sense. It was something better, a sprawling structure of stone and timber that seemed to grow organically from the landscape, its architecture blending modernist clean lines with craftsman warmth. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the lake, which sparkled in the afternoon sun like scattered diamonds. He designed it himself, Randy said, for his wife. It took him 3 years to build, and they lived here for 49 years together. The weight of that history settled over Maria as they approached the front door. 49 years of marriage, of mornings and meals and shared silences, and then 3 years of William sitting alone in a diner, unable to remain in the home where every corner held her ghost. Randy unlocked the door, and they stepped into a stillness so profound it felt sacred. The interior was a time capsule. Antique furniture sat exactly as it must have been left 3 years ago. A book open on the coffee table, reading glasses folded beside it. Photographs lined the walls, decades of moments frozen. William and his wife on their wedding day, young and radiant. William in a hard hat at construction sites. The two of them growing older together, gray-haired and content. The house smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish, and the particular mustiness of a place waiting for life to return. "Take your time," Randy said. "I'll be outside if you need me." Maria moved through the rooms alone, her footsteps muted on Persian rugs. The kitchen was frozen in time, copper pots hanging above a professional range. The living room opened onto a stone terrace with a view that must have been breathtaking at sunset. Everything was beautiful, expensive, and utterly, achingly empty. Then she found the back hallway, and the door at its end. It was closed but unlocked, and when Maria pushed it open, she stepped into something extraordinary. The studio consumed the entire eastern wing of the house. North-facing windows flooded the space with perfect, even light. Easels stood at various angles, canvases both finished and abandoned resting on them. Paint-stained palettes lay scattered across work tables. The smell hit her immediately. Linseed oil, turpentine, the ghost of creative work that had filled this space. William had been a painter. Maria moved between the canvases like someone in a dream. They were portraits, dozens of them, rendered in a style that was realistic but somehow more than photographic. Each one captured not just a face, but a soul. A construction worker with concrete dust in his hair and wisdom in his eyes. A nurse, exhausted but kind. A street musician, joy radiating from his smile. People William must have encountered, observed, remembered, and then honored with his art. He saw people, Maria whispered to the empty room. Really saw them. Then she turned, and her heart stopped. On the largest easel, positioned to catch the best light, was an unfinished portrait. The figure was roughed in, the background only partially painted, but the face was nearly complete. A young woman with dark hair pulled back, wearing a pale blue uniform. She was pouring coffee, caught mid-motion, and sunlight illuminated her face with a warmth that made her seem to glow from within. The expression William had captured was one Maria recognized but had never seen on her own face. Genuine compassion, the kind that came from the soul rather than obligation. It was her. Maria's legs gave out. She sank to the paint-stained floor in front of the easel, staring up at herself through William's eyes. This was how he'd seen her. Not tired, not struggling, not ordinary. Beautiful, radiant, with the simple act of kindness. The tears came then, unstoppable. William had been painting her from memory, from those mornings in the diner, and he'd seen something in her she'd forgotten she possessed. He'd seen the artist she used to be, the dreamer buried under exhaustion and debt, and he'd painted her back into existence. After several long minutes, Maria pulled herself together. The brass key was still in her pocket, warm from her body heat. She looked around the studio and saw it. a door in the far corner, small and easy to miss, with a brass lock that matched her key perfectly. Her hands shook as she fitted the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the door opened onto what must have been William's private study. A desk sat beneath a window overlooking the lake. Bookshelves lined the walls, and on the desk, centered perfectly, was a wooden box. Maria approached it like it might disappear if she moved too quickly. The box was simple but beautiful, made of cherry wood with brass hinges. Inside were letters, dozens of them, each in a separate envelope addressed in William's handwriting. M.M., her initials. With trembling fingers, Maria opened the first one. The letter was dated 3 months ago. Dear Maria, I don't know if you'll ever read these words, but I find I need to write them. Today you told me about your mother's illness, and I saw in your eyes a grief I recognize. You carry so much, and still you find room to be kind. You remind me that goodness exists, that it persists even when the world seems designed to crush it. My wife used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they do when it's easy, but what they choose to do when it costs them something. You choose kindness when you have every reason to choose bitterness. That is no small thing. W.S. Maria opened another, then another. Months of observations, gratitude, and a growing conviction that she represented something William thought the world had lost. The final letter was dated the day before he died. I know my time is short. My doctor has been kind enough to be honest with me. I'm not afraid of death. I've been moving toward it since Margaret left me behind. But I find I'm afraid of leaving this world without ensuring that people like you, Maria, have the chance to thrive. You have a gift for seeing beauty and creating it. The money, the diner, the house, these are tools. Use them to build the life you were meant to live. Paint your paintings. See your Paris. Be the light you've been for me, but this time, let it shine on your own dreams. You are my last great hope. Proof that kindness still matters, that beauty still exists, that tomorrow might be better than today. Don't let the Henry and Claras of the world convince you otherwise. Your friend, William. Maria sat in the study as afternoon light spilled across the lake, holding letters from a dead man who had seen her more clearly than she'd seen herself. The unfinished portrait in the studio, the house full of beautiful things, the key that opened doors to a future she'd never imagined. William hadn't just left her money. He'd left her a mission, a purpose, and a reminder of who she'd been before life had worn her down. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone William Sexton had believed in enough to bet his legacy on. And Maria realized, sitting in that silent house overlooking water that reflected the sky, that she couldn't let him down. The lawsuit arrived 3 days after Maria's visit to the lake house. Randy called her at 6 a.m, his voice tight with controlled anger. They've filed for an injunction. Henry and Clara are claiming undue influence and mental incapacity. They're asking the court to freeze all assets pending investigation into whether you manipulated their father. Maria sat on the edge of her second-hand couch, still in the oversized t-shirt she'd slept in, trying to process words that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. But you said the will was airtight. You said, it is airtight, Randy cut in. This is harassment, pure and simple. They're banking on you not having the resources or stomach for a prolonged legal fight. They want you to give up, to settle for pennies just to make it stop. But Maria, I need you to hear me. We will win this. The question is whether you're prepared for what comes between now and then. She wasn't. How could she be? The story broke the next morning. Waitress inherits billionaire architect's fortune, screamed the headline on Atlanta's morning news. By noon, it had been picked up nationally. By evening, reporters were camped outside her apartment building, cameras tracking her every movement. Maria called in sick to the diner, couldn't face the questions, the stares, the way her coworkers would look at her differently now. Jerry told her to take all the time she needed, his voice careful, like she'd become fragile or dangerous or both. Even the way people spoke to her had changed. Money did that, she was learning. It altered gravity, made you into something other than human. The news coverage was brutal. They found her high school yearbook photo, a younger Maria with bigger dreams and no idea what was coming. They interviewed the other diner regulars who suddenly remembered William in ways that made Maria sound calculating. She was always hovering around him, one woman told a camera crew. I thought it was sweet at the time, but now you have to wonder, don't you? They dug up her student loan debt, her mother's medical bills, painted a picture of a desperate woman who'd seen an opportunity and seized it. The comment sections were vicious. Strangers who'd never met her convinced she was either a master manipulator or a woman who'd traded her body for millions. Both versions made her skin crawl. Henry and Clara gave interviews from the steps of the courthouse, dressed in elegant mourning, their faces masks of dignified grief. "Our father was a proud man who became vulnerable in his final years," Clara said, dabbing at dry eyes. "This young woman took advantage of his loneliness. We're seeking justice, not just for ourselves, but for his memory." The lies were so smooth, so practiced, that Maria found herself almost believing them. Maybe she had been manipulative. Maybe every smile, every cut piece of toast, every moment of warmth had been some unconscious strategy to... No. She stopped herself. That was what they wanted her to think. That was how they'd win, by making her doubt her own heart. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. Randy had tried to prepare her, but nothing could have readied Maria for the reality of a courtroom. It was smaller than she'd imagined, wood-paneled and austere, with fluorescent lights that turned everyone slightly gray. She sat at a table beside Randy, acutely aware of the reporters filling the gallery, their phones and tablets recording every moment. Across the aisle, Henry and Clara sat with their own lawyers, 3 of them, in suits that probably cost more than her inheritance, looking righteous and wounded. The judge was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She listened to Henry and Clara's attorney paint Maria as a predator, a calculating woman who'd isolated a vulnerable old man and poisoned him against his own family. Mr. Sexton's children hadn't seen him in over a year because Miss Mitchell had convinced him they didn't care, the lawyer argued. She created a dependency, made herself indispensable, and then manipulated him into leaving her a fortune that should have gone to his blood relatives. Maria felt sick. The words were lies, but they were such carefully constructed lies that they sounded almost true. Then Randy stood. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's narrative requires us to believe that William Sexton, a man who built a $90 million empire through shrewd business decisions, who was examined by 3 independent psychiatrists and found completely competent mere weeks before his death, was somehow outwitted by a 26-year-old waitress." Randy's voice dripped with controlled contempt. "I'd like to present evidence that tells a different story." He pulled out a laptop, and the courtroom's screen flickered to life with security footage from the Highland Diner. The timestamp read 14 months ago, long before William had ever changed his will. The footage showed William entering the diner, taking his usual booth. It showed Maria approaching with coffee, smiling that tired but genuine smile. It showed her later, cutting his toast without being asked, the gesture so natural it was clear this was routine, not performance. "This footage spans 14 months, Randy continued. "Every morning, 7:15, booth 4. Mr. Sexton chose to be there. Miss Mitchell never contacted him outside the diner, never visited his home, never asked for anything. She simply showed basic human kindness to a customer who came to her place of work." More footage played. Months of mornings compressed into minutes. William sitting alone, Maria refilling his coffee. The 2 of them never touching except for her brief, gentle hand on his shoulder one morning when he'd been looking at his wife's photo. "Mr. Sexton changed his will of his own volition," Randy said, his voice rising with conviction. "He did so because Miss Mitchell treated him with dignity when his own children had forgotten he existed. The plaintiff's claim that she manipulated him is not just wrong, it's an insult to Mr. Sexton's memory and judgment." He produced William's letters then, the ones from the study, and read them aloud. Maria watched Henry's face redden, watched Clara's jaw tighten as their father's words filled the courtroom. Words about kindness and loneliness and finding hope in the smallest gestures. "When wealth made me invisible, you looked at me," Randy read, his voice softening. "When my hands shook, you steadied them. The diner is yours. Keep it warm." The judge was silent for a long moment after Randy sat down. Then she removed her glasses and looked directly at Henry and Clara. "I've reviewed the psychiatric evaluations. I've seen the footage. I've read Mr. Sexton's letters, which demonstrate not only mental competency, but considerable emotional intelligence." She paused. "This injunction is denied. The will stands as written, and I would suggest that the plaintiffs consider carefully before pursuing this matter further. The evidence suggests your father knew exactly what he was doing and why. Case dismissed." The gavel fell like thunder. Maria made it to Randy's car before she broke down, tears of relief and residual fear and overwhelming exhaustion shaking her body. Randy sat in the driver's seat, giving her space to fall apart. "They'll appeal," she managed between sobs. "They won't stop." "They might try," Randy said, "but they won't win. That judge just destroyed their case. And Henry and Clara know it. Give them a few days. They'll move on to accepting their $43 million and leaving you alone." But when Maria got home that night, reporters still camped outside her building. She didn't feel victorious. She felt hunted, exposed, like her life had been turned inside out for public consumption. She locked herself in her apartment, drew the curtains, and sank to the floor with William's letters spread around her. The media would spin whatever narrative they wanted. Henry and Clara would probably give more interviews, paint themselves as victims. The internet would continue to dissect her life, her choices, her worth. But here, in the quiet of her small apartment, she could read William's words and remember the truth. "You saw me when I had become invisible. You treated me like a man, not a name. That kind of grace cannot be bought or taught. It simply is. And it is rare enough that when found, it should be protected, nurtured, celebrated." Maria pressed the letter to her chest, feeling her breathing slow, her racing heart begin to settle. William had believed in her, not because she was perfect, but because she'd been kind when kindness cost her something, because she'd seen a lonely old man and decided he deserved warmth. The reporters could wait outside forever. Henry and Clara could appeal until they ran out of lawyers. The internet could debate whether she deserved what she'd been given. But Maria knew the truth, and slowly, painfully, she was beginning to believe it. She had earned this, not through manipulation, but through the simple act of treating another human being with dignity, and she would not let anyone take that away from her, not even herself. A week after the hearing, Randy called Maria to his office again. This time she walked through the marble lobby with her head up, ignoring the receptionist's curious stare. She'd stopped reading the comments, stopped watching the news coverage. Let them say what they wanted. She knew who she was. Randy was waiting in a smaller conference room, not the intimidating boardroom from before. This space felt more intimate, with afternoon light streaming through windows that overlooked the city. On the table between them sat a single folder, unmarked. "There's something I need to show you," Randy said without preamble. "Something William instructed me to reveal only after the will was settled and you'd had time to adjust." Maria sat down slowly, her stomach tightening with apprehension. More surprises? One last one. Randy opened the folder carefully, almost reverently. William spent the final year of his life creating something. He worked with our firm to establish it legally, funded it entirely from his personal fortune, and built it specifically for you to manage. He slid a document across the table. The header read, "The Sexton Human Dignity Foundation." Maria scanned the pages, the legal language swimming before her eyes. But certain phrases jumped out. Endowment of $1 billion. Dedicated to supporting individuals demonstrating compassion in the face of hardship. Executive Director, Maria Mitchell. "I don't understand," she whispered. $1 billion? William liquidated significant portions of his investment portfolio last year, Randy explained. He placed it all in an irrevocable trust, money that cannot be touched by his estate, his children, or anyone else. It exists solely to fund this foundation, and he named you as its executive director. The room seemed to tilt. Maria gripped the edge of the table. "That's impossible. I can't. Randy, I'm a waitress. I don't know anything about running a foundation. I barely graduated community college. He didn't choose you for your resume," Randy interrupted gently. "He chose you for something far more valuable." What could I possibly have that's worth?" She gestured helplessly at the document. "This?" Randy leaned forward, his expression intent. "Maria, I've been a lawyer for 23 years. I've worked with hundreds of wealthy clients, helped them distribute fortunes to children, charities, causes, and you know what I've learned? Money is easy to give away. What's rare, what's precious, is knowing who will use it with wisdom and compassion." He tapped the foundation document. William didn't want another typical charity run by business people who've never known struggle. He wanted someone who understood what it meant to work 3 jobs and still come up short. Someone who'd choose kindness even when they had every reason to be bitter. Someone who saw value in a lonely old man that his own children had forgotten. "But I don't know how." "That's why he provided for everything," Randy continued. The foundation has an operational board, financial advisors, program managers, all hired and waiting. They'll handle the mechanics. Your job is to do what you've always done. See people. Really see them. Identify who deserves help and make sure they get it. Maria stared at the document, at her name printed in William's careful instructions. Executive Director. $1 billion foundation. The numbers were so large they lost meaning, became abstract, but the purpose, that she understood. He wanted me to help people the way he helped me, she said slowly. Yes, but more than that. Randy pulled out one final page from the folder, a handwritten note on William's personal stationery. He left this with the foundation documents. He wanted you to read it when you were ready. Maria took the note with trembling hands. Maria, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you know the full scope of what I'm asking of you. I know you're afraid. I know you think you're not qualified, but I watched you for months, and I learned something important. Competence can be taught, but compassion cannot. The world is full of people who know how to manage money. It's desperately short of people who know how to see suffering and respond with grace. You steadied my hands when they shook. Now I'm asking you to steady others. You made a diner feel like home. Now make the world feel a little less cold. I don't need you to be perfect. I need you to be you, the woman who saw an invisible old man and decided he mattered. Do that for others. And my legacy becomes something worth leaving. This is not a burden, Maria. It's an opportunity, and I trust you with it completely. Your friend always, William. The tears came quietly this time. Not the desperate sobs of grief, but something gentler. Acceptance, maybe, or the beginning of belief. Where is he buried? Maria asked suddenly. Randy told her. Oakland Cemetery was quiet in the late afternoon, old oaks casting long shadows across weathered headstones. Randy had offered to come, but Maria needed to do this alone. She found William's grave easily, a simple granite marker beside his wife's, their names side by side after 3 years of separation. Someone had left fresh flowers, probably Clara or Henry trying to perform grief for cameras that weren't watching anymore. Maria sat on the grass beside the grave, not caring about the damp earth soaking through her jeans. She pulled William's note from her pocket, the one about the foundation, and read it aloud to the silent stone. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and pressed it to her heart. I don't know if I can do this, she said to the grave, to the man beneath it, to the memory that felt more present than absence. I'm scared I'll fail you, that I'll make mistakes and waste what you've given me. The wind moved through the oak trees, a sound like whispered reassurance. But I'll try, Maria continued, her voice growing steadier. I'll try because you believed I could, because you saw something in me I'd forgotten was there. I'll help people the way you helped me, not by giving them everything, but by seeing them when they feel invisible, by steadying their hands when they shake. She placed her palm flat against the warm granite, feeling the sun-heated stone, the permanence of it. I promise, she whispered. I promise I'll make this matter. I'll keep the diner warm, just like you asked, and I'll build something beautiful with what you've given me. Not for the money, not for the recognition, but because kindness should echo. Because you taught me that how we treat each other is the only thing that really matters. The cemetery was silent, but Maria felt less alone than she had in weeks. William was gone, but his faith in her remained, solid as the stone beneath her hand. She stood slowly, brushing grass from her jeans, and looked down at the grave one last time. Thank you, she said simply, for seeing me, for trusting me, for reminding me who I am. Then she walked back to her car, shoulders squared, ready to become the person William had always believed she could be. The waitress was gone. The executive director remained. And for the first time since that morning in the diner when lawyers had walked through the door, Maria Mitchell felt ready for whatever came next. 6 weeks after William's funeral, the Highland Diner reopened its doors. Maria had spent those weeks working with contractors, designers, and her own 2 hands to transform the space while keeping its soul intact. The worn vinyl booths had been reupholstered in warm burgundy leather, the cracked linoleum replaced with honey-toned wood that still felt humble, unpretentious. The harsh fluorescent lights swapped for softer fixtures that made the morning sun through the windows feel like a blessing instead of an invasion. But the bones remained the same. the long counter where regulars sat, the kitchen where Jerry still worked the grill, now as a partner with profit sharing and health insurance, the bell above the door that announced each arrival with its familiar metallic chime, and booth 4. Maria had saved it for last, restoring the corner booth with special care. New cushions, a table refinished to gleaming, and mounted on the wall beside it, a small bronze plaque that read, "William's Table, where kindness was seen." She ran her fingers over the engraved letters on opening morning, remembering trembling hands and cut toast, and a loneliness so profound it had needed no words. This booth would always be his. A memorial not to wealth or success, but to the simple act of being present for another human being. The staff arrived at 5. Jerry, plus 3 new hires Maria had chosen carefully. Young people working their way through school, single parents needing flexibility, people who understood struggle and would treat customers the way she'd once treated William. She'd tripled their wages from what she used to make, added benefits, created a place where work didn't have to mean slow erosion of the soul. "You ready for this?" Jerry asked, tying on his apron. He looked younger somehow, the perpetual stress lines around his eyes softening now that he wasn't drowning in debt. "No," Maria admitted with a smile, "but let's do it anyway." The first customers trickled in at 6, some of the old regulars, curious about the changes, plus new faces drawn by the news coverage. Maria had worried they'd come for spectacle to see the waitress who'd inherited millions. But something about the space itself seemed to set the tone. People entered loudly and left quietly, as if the diner had taught them something about respect. At 7:15, the bell chimed and Randy Luis walked through the door. He'd visited the construction site several times, but this was the first time he'd seen the finished diner. His eyes swept the space, taking in the warm lighting, the comfortable booths, the way everything felt renewed but not replaced. When his gaze landed on William's plaque, his professional composure cracked slightly. "He would have loved this," Randy said quietly. Maria led him to booth 4, William's table, and gestured for him to sit. "Coffee? Black?" "You remember." Randy smiled. "I remember everyone's order," Maria said, pouring from a pot that no longer trembled in her hands. "Some habits don't need breaking." She slid into the booth across from him, her own cup steaming between her palms. Outside the window, Atlanta was waking up. The same city, the same streets. But somehow everything looked different now. "The foundation board met yesterday," Randy said. "We've approved the first round of grants. 23 scholarships for students who aged out of foster care. A medical relief program for families dealing with catastrophic illness. Partnership with 3 homeless shelters to fund job training programs." Maria felt warmth bloom in her chest. "That fast?" "You approved them," Randy reminded her. "You read every application yourself, remember? Stayed up until 2 in the morning going through them." She had. Each application, a story, a struggle, a person who just needed someone to see them. She'd wept over some, celebrated others, and understood finally what William had known. Money was just a tool. The real gift was attention, recognition, the act of saying you matter to people the world had taught to feel invisible. "There's more," Randy continued. "We've had over 300 applications for next quarter. The word is spreading. There's a foundation that actually helps real people, not just writes checks to established institutions." "That's what William wanted," Maria said. "Not monuments to his name, but hands reaching down to pull people up." A customer waved for a refill. Maria excused herself, moving through the diner with practiced grace, pouring coffee, taking orders. Exactly as she'd done for years. But it felt different now. Not like servitude, but like service. Not diminishment, but dignity. When she returned, Randy was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What? You're still here," he said. "You have millions in the bank, a lake house, a foundation to run, but you're still pouring coffee at 7:30 in the morning." Maria looked around the diner, at Jerry flipping eggs with the confidence of ownership, at the new waitress learning to balance plates, at the regulars who'd welcomed her back like family, at booth 4, where William's memory lived in polished wood and bronze words. "This is where it started," she said simply, "where William saw me, where I learned that small acts of kindness echo louder than we think." She met Randy's eyes. "The foundation does big things out there, but here in this diner, we do small things with great love. Both matter. William taught me that. Randy raised his coffee cup in a silent toast. Maria clinked hers against it, and they sat in comfortable silence, two people from different worlds brought together by a lonely old man's final act of faith. Outside, the city rushed past. But inside the Highland Diner, time moved differently, at the pace of conversation, of coffee refills, of strangers becoming friends over breakfast. William's table would never be empty again, and Maria would make sure that everyone who sat there felt what William had felt in his final year, seen, valued, and worthy of kindness. That was the legacy. That was the work. And it was only just beginning. 6 months passed like water finding its course. The Sexton Human Dignity Foundation became more than paperwork and bank accounts. It became lives changed. Maria spent her afternoons in the foundation office, reviewing applications with the same attention she'd once given to perfecting latte art. A single mother in Savannah received childcare assistance so she could finish nursing school. A veteran in Macon got the surgery his insurance wouldn't cover. 3 families facing eviction found their rent paid and job training provided, not as charity, but as investment in their dignity. Maria had learned to navigate boardrooms without losing herself, to speak the language of nonprofits while remembering why the work mattered. She hired staff who'd lived the struggles they now helped others overcome. Former foster youth, recovered addicts, people who understood that empathy without experience was just sentiment. But every morning she returned to the diner. She'd arrive before dawn to prep with Jerry, her hands remembering the rhythm of coffee grounds and bacon on the griddle. The foundation board had questioned this at first. Why would their executive director still work breakfast shifts? Randy had defended her simply. Because that's who she is. That's why William chose her. The diner had become something unexpected, a gathering place where foundation recipients sometimes worked, where Maria could see the impact of her decisions in faces across the counter rather than statistics in reports. The young woman bussing tables was completing her GED through a foundation scholarship. The line cook had gotten sober with help from their addiction recovery program. Kindness wasn't abstract here. It was eggs over easy and second chances served with morning coffee. It was a Tuesday in March when Maria saw him. The bell chimed at 7:20, 5 minutes after the usual rush. An elderly man stood in the doorway, blinking against the morning sun streaming through the windows. He wore a threadbare cardigan despite the warming weather, and his eyes held that particular emptiness that comes from profound loneliness, the look of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to matter. He hesitated, seeming to debate whether entering was worth the effort. Then his gaze found the empty counter seat, and he shuffled forward with the careful steps of someone whose bones hurt more than they used to. Maria approached with a clean cup and a warm smile, the same smile she'd given William, the same one she gave everyone, because she'd learned that you never knew whose life you were saving with the simple act of paying attention. "Good morning," she said, setting the cup down gently. "Coffee?" He nodded, not quite meeting her eyes. Maria poured, watching his weathered hands wrap around the cup for warmth. She recognized the signs, the isolation, the quiet surrender to invisibility, the way the world had taught him to expect nothing and no one. "Black, no sugar, right?" she said, though she'd never seen him before. His head lifted, surprise flickering across his lined face. He met her eyes for the first time, and in that brief moment, something shifted. He wasn't invisible, not here, not to her. "Yes," he said softly. "How did you know?" "Just a feeling," Maria smiled. "What can I get you for breakfast?" As he studied the menu with trembling fingers, Maria glanced at booth 4, at William's plaque gleaming in the morning light. The words etched in bronze had become her daily reminder, her mission statement written by a man who'd understood that the truest wealth couldn't be counted. Where kindness was seen. William Sexton had spent a lifetime buying everything money could purchase: buildings and land, art and influence, comfort and security. But his last transaction, his final and most important purchase, had been faith. Faith in a waitress who couldn't be bought because she'd never been for sale. Faith that kindness mattered, that small acts echoed across lifetimes, that how we treat each other in the ordinary moments was the only extraordinary thing that ever really mattered. He'd left her money, yes. But more importantly, he'd left her proof that being seen could save a life. And now she spent every morning offering that same gift to others, The radical act of paying attention, of treating strangers like they mattered, of pouring coffee with the understanding that sometimes a warm cup and a warmer smile was the difference between surrendering and surviving another day. The old man ordered eggs and toast. Maria wrote it down, her hand steady, her purpose clear. Outside, Atlanta rushed toward its future. But inside the Highland Diner, in Booth 4 and at the counter, and in every small interaction, William's legacy lived on, not in buildings that bore his name, but in the quiet revolution of compassion practiced daily by someone who'd learned its value from a lonely man who desperately needed to be reminded he was still human. The kindness echoed, the cycle continued, and Maria understood finally that this was always how redemption worked, not in grand gestures, but in coffee poured with care, in eyes that chose to see, in the persistent belief that tomorrow could be gentler than today if only we were brave enough to be kind. The morning light spilled golden across the counter. The old man began to eat. And Maria Mitchell, executive director and waitress, billionaire's heir and ordinary woman, continued the work that mattered most, making sure that no one who walked through her door would ever feel invisible again. Leave A if you believe kindness still counts, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that prove it.